It was partially that. Some people in the design team at Apple saw the app, but they were also familiar with my work on Reactable, and they were familiar with the design I did for it. So they reached out to me a few months after I launched Samplr, and here I am, almost 7 years later. Yeah.
iOS music making has changed a lot over the years, and today we have access to apps that give us a workflow more akin to the type of workflow we have been able to use on desktop and laptop systems for decades. And the thing is, there's something being a little bit lost in this kind of switch from what used to be a standalone app kind of deal into what we have today, where everything can be connected through MIDI, able to link, everything is being loaded up as plugs. And that is the simple act of just loading up an app. And when it's open, it's effectively turned your iDevice into a multi-touch instrument. Now, I'm not saying that we're no longer getting apps like that, but we used to get them more in the past. And as a reference, looking back at 2012, well, we got Borderlands Granular, TC11, and Samplr. These three apps were designed to turn the iPad into an instrument, and they did it exceptionally well. Now, the stars of this haQ attaQ Docutorial are, of course, Samplr and its creator, Marcos Alonso. Now, in this video, you'll hear about the origins of Samplr, how it all got started, how Marcos thinks about the design for Samplr, and also the future for this app. Either way, I want to highlight the stuff that makes Samplr so powerful. And I want to highlight some stuff that could be easily missed. So to get started, who is Marcos Alonso?
Hello, my name is Marcos, and I'm the developer of Samplr. I'm from Spain, Barcelona, but for the past 6 years, I live in San Francisco, where I work for Apple, but I'm part of the UI design team. So before that, I was a developer of Samplr, and before that, I was responsible for the interface of the design of the Reactable, which was a musical instrument with a tangible interface. It was a table-shaped synthesizer with blocks that you move on the surface. That was one of the first instruments I designed, and after that, I got into iOS and I designed and developed Samplr.
So what is it exactly that makes Samplr so powerful? Well, quite frankly, I would say that it is the different play modes. You see, you have 7 different play modes, and if we look down here at this section, there are 6 sample slots, and each one of these sample slots can have a play mode assigned to it. Now, these play modes will allow you to loop samples, play samples with a keyboard, auto-trigger samples, scratch samples, slice samples, and you even have the ability to do granular synthesis. Now, what's so great about this is that you actually get the chance of building your own instrument here, because you can combine these play modes any way you want. For instance, one thing I like doing is loading up the same sample in 6 different slots and then using 6 different types of play modes. And every time I do, I always end up having fun or making something that I can actually use. thing I've always been curious about is the origins of Samplr, or the concept of Samplr, how it was conceived. And in order to get the full story, we have to start at the beginning, where Marcos was working with the design of Reactable.
We developed the instrument in college in this university in Barcelona called Pompeu Fabra in the music technology group. We developed the instrument, and then we left the university to start the company. And it was Gunther Geiger and me who started the company. I was there for about 3 years before I left to do Samplr and then moved to San Francisco. And I was involved on the app, but not on the versions after 2012. On 2012, I stopped working for Reactable, but they kept making software and tables. I didn't really work on the Reactable app. I didn't write, because at the time at Reactable, I was more of like doing design and managing the company. So I was not programming at Reactable at all. None of the code or the skills from the Reactable app translated to their Samplr app. They are completely unrelated. Samplr is something that I made by myself on my own.
Now, Marcos did, of course, have a lot more to say when it came to the jump from Reactable to Samplr, and we'll hear more about it later on. Now we're gonna get into play modes, but before we dive into that, I need to point something out, and it has to do with the marker system. You see, if we look at the user interface, we have 7 icons in this bar here, and this is the play mode selector. Right below the play mode selector, we have the settings for predefined markers, and we also have the marker editing button. Now, this thing will work a little bit differently depending on what mode you're in, but some of these modes don't even have settings for markers or predefined markers. I will highlight when stuff works a little bit different. Just keep an eye on this thing as we go through the play modes, and you'll see when this thing gets blacked out. As I said, I don't want to make the most in-depth tutorial of everything in here, and I don't feel like I need to, because if you want to know more about the interface, then just press this question mark and you'll get one of those old school overlay reference guides. And these are great because you can still see the whole app. It just simply highlights the stuff that is important and explains it. I love it when developers do it this way because you're never leaving the app, you're not going to another window, you're not opening up this bright white PDF. No, you're still in the app with this overlay. I highly recommend this overview. Okay, so now we're gonna get into one of my most favorite play modes, and it is the tape/scratch play mode. What you just saw there is one of the reasons why I went against making a deep tutorial on this thing, because in order to demonstrate what a thing does in Samplr, you simply select it and use it, and you'll see instantly what it does. Now there is another mode in here, it's called Scratch, and what it does is... Right now, people might not be so keen on going outside, but once that's possible, I'm thinking a lot of people will be very keen on going outside. As you can see, both modes are pretty straightforward, just tap and play. However, I want to show you something a little extra in here. Okay, so I'm adding 32 predefined markers by pressing 32. And what I want you to do is to listen closely now, because now you'll hear a stepping of the pitch. And you know, having a stepped pitch can be very useful in some cases. I just wanted to highlight that because I'm sure that some of you out there are going to use this mode to do something awesome. Okay, so you've been hearing a lot about Reactable, and it is simply because it is a big part of Marcos's development history when it comes to interactive designs. And one thing I wanted to find out about that was, what was the motivation of even going on that path, making instruments like that, tactile instruments that are, well, I would say that they're very visually pleasing when you look at both Reactable and Samplr. And this is what Marcos said.
So when we made the Reactable, the problem was that there were really good tools to make music with computers, but they were really hard to perform live. You would go to a concert and you would see a guy behind a laptop and you had no idea what was going on. So I felt like something got lost when music transitioned to electronic music and music made in computers. Because when you're listening to rock music, you can imagine the people performing that music. But when you're listening to electronic music, it's completely abstract. There's no connection between the sound and the performer making the sound. So, and that is something that I'm always been obsessed with. And that's what started the Reactable. This idea of, let's make an instrument that is designed for the musician, but it's also designed for the audience. So the audience can see what you're doing with the instrument. And then it was the same for Samplr. I wanted to make something that felt more like a physical instrument that you can grab and make music with, like a guitar or like a drum set. It's not so much about like composing a song in the studio and doing it perfectly. It's more like I can just take it, start jamming and start making music. I think the best way to project this is to have a camera that captures your hands and the display. Yeah, because the hand gestures are so connected to the way it works.
So right now I want to get into granular synthesis. As I mentioned before, Samplr allows you to do that, and there are two modes where you can actually perform this type of synthesis. And for those of you who don't know, granular synthesis is basically looping something very small, a fragment of something, looping it at high speed until you get a new sound out of it. And there you go, granular synthesis. As you can see, this mode is pretty self-explanatory. You put down your finger, and as soon as you do that, you get this sampling window. Now you control the size of the sampling window with this control here on the side. And to get granular synthesis, you simply just have to pull it all the way down until you get the smallest sampling window possible. I also want to add that you have up to 4 notes in this mode, so you can play this with 4 fingers. Now, what I really like about this mode is that you could turn any type of sample into a pad sound. Now, I want to show you the second mode that will allow you to do granular synthesis in here. But first, I thought I'd let Marcos talk about how he went from Reactable to Samplr.
So with the Reactable, we had this big table with a multi-touch surface. This was around 2004, before the iPhone came out. So before multi-touch was mainstream and there was hardware available, we made this multi-touch surface. On the Reactable, we had some gestures where you could just touch the waveform to mute it, for instance, or you could also do like a cat gesture to mute audio flow. So I remember at some point I had like some waveforms on the table, and I was thinking, I was trying to imagine if it would be possible to just make music by touching the waveform somehow. So the idea happened around, I would say, 2006 or so. And I wrote it down. I had the sketches, the original sketches for the app, and I forgot about it because I was too focused on the Reactable. And then I remember when the first iPad came out, I remember that idea. I was like, oh, maybe the iPad is the right hardware for this idea. And I started sketching, and that's how it actually started. It's super interesting because none of the ideas in those early sketches ended up in the app. But it's still like the origin of what became Samplr.
Okay, so let's have a look at the other mode that will let us do granular synthesis. It's this mode over here. It's called a looper, and the way you interact with it is with 2 fingers. So you're basically setting the sampling window size with your fingers. It can be as wide as the screen space, or it can be very, very small, and this is where we get into granular synthesis territory. Now, I'll show you real quick in a second, but I want to add something first. You see, when you got your fingers closely spaced together, you can actually cross them and reverse the sample playback, meaning it will now loop the sample, but it will play it backwards. And on top of that, you have a ping pong mode. So when you activate that, well, the sampling marker will just bounce back and forth between your fingers. And this mode is also great for pads. Now, before we move on from the looper mode and the bow mode, I just want to add that I usually remove all markers when I use these modes because I don't want stuff locking to the markers. You can see that that's what's happening when I move the fingers. Here it's like seamless, and then I get close to the marker and it locks to that. Next up, I want you to hear from Marcos himself talking about the inspiration behind the design of Samplr.
After working on Reactable, I wanted to do something different. I was also influenced a lot by the looks of the EOP one. So the Teenage Engineering, at the time I was working on Samplr, they announced the EOP one, I think. And I love the look of it and the aesthetics of it. So I would say like Samplr is like a mix of influence from companies like Teenage Engineering or even Electron, mixed with my past working on Reactable. And then I got some help from this very good friend of mine called Gerard Rocha, who is an amazing designer from Barcelona, who helped me out a lot with the final colors and some tweaks for the UI.
Okay, so there is a mode in here that is so straightforward and simple because it doesn't really have any touch controls, and it is the loop player mode. It just plays back whatever you load in here, and you have a play stop button right there. Now, there is one extra control, and it actually syncs the playback start of the sample to the tempo. And that's all you need to know about this play mode. I think it's safe to say that Samplr is probably one of the most successful music apps out there. I mean, Marcos really nailed it down. And that is why when I interviewed Marcos, there's this one thing he said that I just find so funny today.
I remember the first time I had one of my best friends, who is an amazing musician, try the app, one of the early versions of the app. He sat in front of it and he was unable to make one sound. He was like, how does this work? This doesn't make any sense. And I was pretty worried that maybe Samplr was too weird, because I knew it was different to the way most apps work. It's not a traditional app per se with a piano roll and stuff, but I kept going because I liked the idea. And to be honest, I didn't have many beta testers because I approached this as a personal project. I wasn't even trying to make money out of it. I almost released it for free because I saw it more of as an experiment, something that I did on the side just for fun. But I'm glad it took off and people really embraced it and people really like how it works.
I did actually ask Marcos about the future of Samplr, and I asked him two specific questions. One question being, is there a chance that Samplr will receive audio unit support? And I also asked him if we would ever see iPhone support for Samplr. Now, Marcos gave me some really thorough answers, and we'll get to those later. I know, I'm being annoying, but that's the end of the teaser, and now we're gonna get into the keyboard play mode. I know I've already said it once, but I'll say it again. It really is straightforward doing tutorials with Samplr. You just simply choose a thing and use a thing and you'll know what that thing does. Okay, so there are some controls in here that I want to highlight, and I'll start with the ones we can find here on the left side. So this one here is a legato control. So it simply turns the legato mode on or off. Now the function above here, this is an attack quantization. And normally with this deactivated, whenever you're triggering a note here on the keyboard, it will just instantly trigger that note. However, when you have the attack quantization activated, you can pretty much just hit the keyboard any way you want, but it will only trigger notes according to the BPM, effectively syncing your note triggering. Okay, so here's an instance where the marker system works differently compared to what it does in other modes. And as you can see, the predefined marker selection bar is grayed out, so we can't do any selections there. However, the marker editing button is still here. And when we press that, we do get two markers, one at the far left and one at the far right. And these will allow you to set the start and end point of the sample. And that's it. we have two modes left, the slice mode and the arpeggiator mode. And I think it makes more sense to show you the slice mode first, which will make the arpeggiator make more sense later on. Well, before we get into the slice mode, let's have a listen to what Marcos had to say about the questions on whether there will be audio unit support and iPhone support for Samplr.
When I first launched Samplr, the iPhones were much smaller. The whole thing about Samplr is how you interact with the waveform, how to use multi-touch on the actual waveform, and use both hands to control it. And I felt like the iPhone at the time was too tiny for that. It was not going to be a great experience. But now that the iPhones are bigger, it's something else that I've been looking into. And it could be something related to the AUV3 update where the UI is more scalable. I think it's super interesting now that the phones are getting bigger. The biggest problem with AUV3 is that the current UI of Samplr is very static and it's designed for full screen and it's very fixed. So the moment I put it in a smaller window, it's not going to be nice. So if I add support for AUV3, I want it to work great. So I'll have to change the UI somehow so it works better in a smaller window. I'm thinking about it, but I haven't decided how to implement it yet.
You know, I started this video talking about a time in the past where we used to get apps that were basically made for standalone mode. Apps that would just open up and turn your iPad into an instrument. And Samplr was one of those apps, is still one of those apps, and will always be one of those apps, at least for me. And listening to Marcos, well, it kind of sounds like that's how he views Samplr too. And you know, considering the user interface of Samplr, how immediate it is, how interactive it is, you know, all of the controls available at the same time on the same page, no real menu diving. Well, do you really want to compromise that just to add audio unit support, just to fit the app into a smaller format? And the same question goes for iPhone support. It is an interesting question, and I guess in this case, we'll just have to wait and see what Marcos does, because he's thinking about it, and that is a good thing. Okay, so next up we're gonna have a look at the slicer play mode. Okay, this is a perfect time for me to show you the marker system and how to utilize it for the slicer mode. One of the things I really enjoy doing with the slicer play mode is using drum loops as my source material and then setting up my markers so that I'm able to play all of the drum sounds individually. Okay, so we have a predefined selection of markers that we can add, but I don't want to do that. I'm going to set it to 0 and then I'm going to set up my own. So the way we do that is by activating the marker editing button over here. And to add a marker, we simply tap in the bright area down here. And that's how easy it is to add a marker. You can now drag it around by tap holding and dragging it back and forth until you get it to the position you want to have it, and you can test it instantly. Now I'm gonna add a few more, and oops, I added one too many and I want to remove it. The way you do that is by tap holding on the marker you want to remove and drag upwards, and it's gone. And this is how simple it is.
The internet in general has democratized a lot of things. Making videos, making video, sharing stuff online, making music. The internet in general has democratized making music. The internet in general has democratized making music.
So there's only one more thing I want to add about this, and that is, well, there are 3 controls here to the side. The first one is the attack quantization, and we recognize that one from the keyboard mode. And it actually quantizes the slice triggerings to the tempo, so it syncs the playback. Now, the next control is an auto trigger, and when you activate that, it will automatically trigger the slices. So it will go from left to right, just play all the slices the way that you've set them up with the markers. And if you don't want them to go just, in the same direction, you can use the shuffle mode underneath, and it will actually shuffle the playback around when you're using the auto triggering. So we just had a look at the slicer play mode, and next up we'll be having a look at the arpeggiator play mode. And in both of these play modes, you do work a lot with markers. And now you know how that works. But before we look at the arpeggiator play mode, the seventh and final play mode, well, I did ask Marcos about why there are 6 sample slots in Samplr. You see, when it comes to software and computers, I'm so used to this 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 120. You see what I mean? 6, though, is a very specific number. Why 6? Well, this is what Marcos said.
This app was developed on an iPad 2, and it worked well on an iPad 1 in terms of performance. And the iPad 1 was not very fast. The design is constrained by the limitations of the hardware at the time. I eventually added more voices, and the latency is smaller now. But the 6 voices was the limitation of the original hardware. And that is something that in the future, given like how fast new iPads are, which are like insanely fast, I wouldn't have the limitation. I could have any number of voices, which is something I could do on a future update.
So we are going to have a look at the arpeggiator play mode, and we already know how markers work, and I'm just going to play this. But before I do that, I want you to have a look at the side here, because like any other arpeggiator mode in any other synth, this one has a sequence order control, and it's basically like an arpeggiator direction. If you've ever used an arpeggiator in any other synth, then you usually have a control to set the arpeggiator to either go, forward or play notes backwards or randomly. Well, that's what this button sets over here. And lastly, you have 2 buttons here, and these will allow you to increase or decrease the speed of the arpeggiator. And that's how simple and straightforward it is. Something that I haven't gone through yet is the effects section, and I will really quickly just touch upon that because there is this one function with the reverb that I just want to highlight because it could be confusing, especially for new users of Samplr. But before I do that, I was curious to hear about Marcos and his work at Apple. Now, he couldn't tell us exactly what he's doing at Apple, and I get it for obvious reasons, but he did say something, and so this is what he said.
My team is called haQ, which is the team responsible for the UI for all the products, actually. And actually, last year, we did this talk at WWDC, where we were talking about the way we work at Apple and the way we design interfaces and the way we think about interaction and fluidity. It's called Designing Fluid Interfaces. So if you're curious and you want to learn more about what I do at Apple, you can watch that talk. Yeah, highly recommend that video. I would, if you're interested in seeing what I do at Apple these days.
Okay, so I want to touch upon the effect section real quick. And I know there's loads of stuff I haven't gone through. A lot of people probably get crazy with me for not going into how you actually sample with Samplr. But here's the thing, I will be making a video on just sampling with Samplr, going through all the ways you can do that, basically covering all bases. So real quick, we know we have 6 sample slots, and each of the sample slots have 4 effects individually that can be used on the sample slots. Yeah, I know I made that sentence more contrived than I had to, but 4 effects per slot. And many would look at this and say, Jakob, you're wrong, there are 5 effects in here. Yes, I know, but it turns out that this effect down here, the reverb, it has a control that works globally. And it is the time control, the size, whatever you want to call it. So if you're setting it when you're in one slot, and then you go to another slot and you change it, well, you're changing it for all the slots. It doesn't matter which slot you're in, this one is always globally changed. And so keep that in mind, because it can be confusing for beginners getting into Samplr. You know, one of the things I like the most about this job is actually talking to developers, because I've said it many times, they're my heroes. They're the tool makers. They're the ones making the stuff that I can then use to express myself musically any way I want, basically. There are so many good tools out there, and Samplr is definitely one of the best. And so thank you, Marcos, for the interview. Thank you for Samplr, and thank you for continuing supporting this app and keeping it alive, because it would be a shame to see it go. Also, a huge thanks to the iOS music community for making this community such a nice community to be in. How many times did I say community there? And I want to thank you viewers who have stuck around watching through this, because viewing time is everything here on YouTube. And when you spent 3 months on one video, then it feels good that people are actually watching it. So thank you. Now, one of the easiest ways of helping this channel, supporting me and the work I do here, is by hitting the thumbs up and also dropping a comment down below. And sharing the video, well, that's an extra thing that really helps this channel out. Now, if you want to support me in a financial way, you have the Patreon that you can sign up to and a PayPal link over there. If you want to find my music, then you can go to jakobhaq.com/music. And I haven't updated it in a while. I just saw that. I'm looking at it on my phone here. But yeah, I'm gonna try to update that as soon as possible. Now, as usual, I want to thank you so much for watching. All comments and ratings are very much appreciated. Now go finger all of your stuff and have a lot of fun doing it. And follow me on Instagram